So today on Food Farm Talk on CFRU, we're finding out more about the Farmers for Climate Solutions campaign. We're talking to Katie Ward, the National President of the National Farmers Union, and Brent Preston, President of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. Both their organizations are partners in the Farmers for Climate Solutions campaign. And that campaign was launched on Agriculture Day on February 11th, 2020. At Food Farm Talk, we try to delve behind the superficial headlines to get to more of the substance of the topic at hand. So to do that, I have Katie and Brent on the line today to talk in true COVID-19 format. We're speaking from our own homes in different parts of the province. So Katie and Brent, why don't we start out by each of you briefly introducing yourself and your farming situation, and a little bit about your organization, so listeners can understand something about you as people and about your organizations. And then we'll talk more about the campaign after that.
Sure, thank you. I farm in Eastern Ontario. I raise sheep and pigs on pasture, and I sell my lamb and pork products at farmers markets and to a few restaurants, which is currently obviously undergoing some marketing rethinking in these physical distancing times that we're living through. So representing the National Farmers Union, we're a grassroots organization working on behalf of farmers for a food system that respects the dignity of work on our farms and ensures an economically fair and environmentally sound food system so we can continue to grow and raise food. We represent thousands of farmers from coast to coast, producing everything from grain for export to livestock farmers to market gardeners and everything in between. And we all believe that we have a stronger voice when we work together for agricultural policy and on behalf of eaters.
Thanks, Paul. So my wife Gillian and I run an operation called the New Farm. We grow vegetables near Creemore, Ontario, just about an hour and a half northwest of Toronto. And we're certified organic, and we grow primarily for the wholesale restaurant industry. Union, but I'm the board president of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. And we represent farmers all across the province, working as to build community, to help farmers build resilient ecological farms, and to build a strong knowledge-sharing community. So we've been around for 40 years, and really the core of our mandate is to help our members become better farmers and to farm in a way that is going to enhance biodiversity, improve the environment, increase the health of their soils, and build resilient, equitable communities around agriculture in Ontario.
So you launched this new campaign on Agriculture Day in February. And can you talk a bit about how the campaign was developed and the general purpose behind it?
Sure. So about a year ago, the National Farmers Union and Seed Change, which was formerly USC Canada, and the Prairie Climate Center out of Manitoba, got together and started discussing the common interests that we had in developing a space for farmers to talk about the concerns we were having about climate change. So we started looking at what we were going to be able to do to create a space for discussion around this, and that led to the National Farmers Union producing a report called Tackling the Farm Income Crisis and the Climate Crisis. Subsequent to that report being launched, we were able to then open up discussions with the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario and Ecological and Farm Folk, City Folk out of British Columbia, Rural Roots to Climate Solutions out in Alberta, form this coalition that has become Farmers for Climate Solutions and advance the discussion on a national level envisioning, what we can do to advance solutions to the problems that we're all seeing in our food system. We were really pleased to be able to broaden the coalition to the extent that we have already, and we're really pleased to get folks such as Brent and Gillian at COG, Canadian Organic Growers as well, and really start digging into this and helping to develop policy solutions that are going to help our government support farmers to do the right thing in this situation we find ourselves.
Late last year, there were quite a few different organizations that realized that we all had this sense that we needed to do something urgently about the issue of climate and agriculture. That there is sort of a window opening where not just farmers but the broader public are realizing that agriculture right now is a big part of the climate problem, but that there's also potential for agriculture to be a really important and positive part of the climate solution. So we realized that working together, we were going to have a much bigger impact.
So you talked about the genesis and some of the organizations behind the current membership and how you came together. And obviously you have a lot of shared values between the organizations. So have you tried, or will you be trying to kind of recruit other farm and commodity organizations to build a bigger coalition within agriculture? Because there are a huge number of, even at the national level, farm organizations like Canadian Federation of Agriculture and all the different commodity organizations as well. So is that part of your plan?
Sure. We are currently in discussions with a number of organizations across the country, and the list of organizations that have expressed interest is growing every day. We are absolutely interested in building a broader coalition and helping to move this conversation to a place where we have as many voices as possible as farmers and as an agriculture industry produce about 11 or 12% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, but we're really uniquely positioned to make reductions to that with some choices that we can make relatively easily on our farms. And there's a lot of different groups in agriculture that can help to get that information to their membership and help engage farmers across the country. And we're really encouraged by how many groups have already reached out to us, for sure.
Yeah, I think that the goal is really to build as broad a coalition as possible. And I think there's a really unique moment right now where a lot of the barriers that I've seen we've been farming for 15 years, and the barriers that I've seen between so-called conventional agriculture and organic agriculture or ecological agriculture are really starting to break down. And we're realizing that people in all parts of the farmers of all stripes have things to learn from each other. And I think that it's a really great opportunity right now to rally around this idea of fighting climate change, because all of the things that we're going to do on our farms to reduce our outputs or reduce our emissions and increase the amount of carbon we can sequester on our farms, those are all things that are going to have all kinds of other knock-on benefits in terms of profitability and decreased costs and increased productivity. So we think it's a really great moment to broaden the tent and bring a lot of people into this effort.
So building on what you just said, so your website talks about promoting low input, low emission practices and moving away from those high input, high emissions farming practices that rely heavily on fossil fuels, fertilizers, pesticides, plastics, and other inputs. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit, and maybe you can talk about what you mean by that, and both yourselves and your organizations.
Sure. So I think some of the really important work that the National Farmers Union has done in their Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis report is to really clearly illustrate that high input agriculture is high emissions agriculture. So the carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing coming out of the agriculture sector primarily derive from the use of the high use of agricultural inputs. And it's also this high input model of agriculture that's been promoted for decades now in Canada that is really the fundamental cause of the farm income crisis. So farmers are bringing lots of money in through their operations, but almost all of it is going to pay for, seed, fertilizer, machinery, equipment, interest on debt. It's all, the NFU is illustrated that something like 97% of all of the gross farm receipts are being paid out for inputs of one description or another. So we feel that by finding new practices on the farm that can reduce our reliance on these inputs, we're going to both make our farms more profitable and decrease our emissions. So that's really the one of the core ideas behind this campaign is that low input agriculture is low emission agriculture, and it's also more profitable agriculture.
So, Katie, maybe you can add your perspective to that. And I guess what I'm also thinking about is there's lots of farmers who rely on these kinds of inputs just to make a living, and how you bridge that gap, because they would not necessarily be attracted to that kind of messaging. So
no, and you're absolutely right. Part of the reason that we were so enthusiastic about the research that led to this report that we put out, the research has really shown us that current practices or recently adopted practices like following the 4 R's for nitrogen fertilizer, about making sure that you're not overusing inputs because you need to have the scientific information to use them appropriately. You can reduce your application. And I use nitrogen fertilizer as an example because it is one of those unique inputs that has all 3 of the main greenhouse gases, being nitrous oxide and methane and carbon dioxide, in both production and as an after effect of its use. You can reduce, if farmers across Canada, reduce their nitrogen fertilizer usage by about 15%, following good practices, they can see very little, if any, reduction in overall yield, but reduce their input costs by about $850 million, which would be a huge help to the bottom line of farmers that are struggling with very little net income. And that's the key financial struggle. We wanted to build a business case for doing the right thing by the environment. And we really think that a lot of the information that we've put together shows, when you dig into it, that we can make relatively simple, if not necessarily intuitive, changes on our farms that are going to help us be more financially stable on our farms. That being said, though, we do need to make clear that we're not saying, go back to Little House on the Prairie. This is not just a, everybody's going to have horse-drawn agriculture to reduce their fossil fuels, and then farming is going to be great. That's not what we're calling for at all. We are talking about using science and technology and as appropriate on our farms, to produce the good and healthy and environmentally sound food that we need to feed Canadians, and where necessary and appropriate, maintain our export markets. But we think that farmers need to know that there is a business case for environmentally friendly and climate friendly agriculture on our farm, we can make this case to government as well to increase our climate friendly agriculture policy. And when I say increase, I mean initiate, really. Quite frankly, our government policy has not, up until recently, had that climate lens applied to agriculture, and we, as a group in Farmers for Climate Solutions, really feel like as we develop our policy recommendations for government, that needs to be the baseline. That we really start advocating that government policy has a place in how our agriculture industry is structured, and that government policy really does need to take into account the climate crisis and what farmers both are dealing with in terms of the interruptions that we're facing on our farm from extreme weather and such, as well as the solutions that we can provide, and helping to provide information to farmers and incentive to farmers to make these changes on our farm.
Well, that's great. I think that helps clarify, gives us a little more detail on what you have in mind beyond the generalities. And so we're switching there to government policy. So, and as you say, you're advocating for new innovative policies beyond what we have now to help farmers fight and adapt to climate change. So maybe you could talk about the kinds of things you have in mind for those innovative policies, or the process you'll use to kind of come up with those to propose to federal and provincial governments.
Sure. So as a relatively new group, we are definitely still, we're working on our policy development to make those recommendations to government, both at the federal and provincial level. But one thing that we all agree on as collaborating organizations is that government policy agriculture policy needs to be looked at through a climate lens. So much of what government tends to do over time is, to use an agricultural metaphor, is to sort of slide into siloed ways of thinking and ways of addressing problems. We do need to have a bit more of a holistic view of things. One perspective that the National Farmers Union brings to the Farmers for Climate Solutions collaboration is that we really feel that there's a place for government to re-implement extension services and information provision for farmers as a neutral and scientific body to provide this information to farmers about what they can be doing, and to recognize that current agriculture policy incentivizes a model that drives farmers to just always produce more and more and more. There needs to be a focus on externalities that come with that, costs that aren't necessarily accounted for, that our environment is paying, and that are sort of coming home to roost on our farms in terms of extreme weather.
So, as Katie said, we're in the very early stages of developing this coalition, and we're still sort of in the active policy formation phase of development of this campaign. But there are a few sort of overarching ideas that are clear from the beginning. We talked about the need for a lower input model of agriculture. I think there's also a consensus among the groups that a focus on soil health is really important. So soil health is sort of the center point that brings together a lot of these ideas about mitigating climate change, making our farms more resilient to climate change, increasing our profitability and improving farmer livelihoods. So we're going to be looking for government policies that really reward farmers for taking care of their soil, that encourage farmers to do that, that provide them with the science and the knowledge that they need in order to be the best stewards of their soil. So when we talk about switching, trying to reduce our inputs, if we can increase soil organic matter in our agricultural soils, we can, it's a demonstrated fact that we can then reduce the amount of fertilizer inputs that we need in that soil. That has an environmental and climate benefit. We can increase the soil's capacity to absorb water in heavy rainfall events, which makes us more resilient to the effects of climate change that we're already seeing. It can improve yields and increase profitability that improves farmer livelihoods. So we get all of these co-benefits from having really healthy living soils on our farms. So, but implementing these kind of practices that promote healthy soils, they're not free, right? Farmers have to experiment. They have to perhaps buy new equipment. They have to learn new methods that they might not have used before. And so these are all areas where government can provide support, financially or technically through information to help farmers make that transition.
Why don't we end up with this last question on climate policy, as you've already the existing climate policy we get from the federal and provincial governments has not had much for agriculture, as you've already alluded to. In particular, the federal climate plan, you have a national campaign, so let's talk about the federal government. So the federal climate plan is the pan-Canadian framework for clean growth and climate change, and it had very little to say about agriculture, but it did defer to the Canadian Agricultural Partnership as the main mechanism for implementation, and we're seeing implementation of some work on, particularly on soil health in Ontario, related that comes out of the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. But the Trudeau government has promised a new climate plan, a more ambitious one soon. Given what you've been talking about so far, are you putting a lot of eggs in that basket to try to get more from the Trudeau government in their forthcoming revised climate plan? And the kind of things you've been talking about so far, are you hoping to get some of that in this new plan with some greater mention of agriculture in that forthcoming plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different avenues that we're going to pursue. We'd like to see a bigger role for agriculture overall in the Canadian government's climate action plan. We would like to see, as Katie said before, a bigger emphasis from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada on climate change. We think that the Canadian Agricultural Partnership is absolutely a vehicle that could be used to implement a lot of these policies. We're looking very, very carefully at CAP right now, sort of hoping that I think it's 2023, the new Canadian Agricultural Partnership will come into effect, and we hope that there's a big emphasis on climate change mitigation, emissions reduction, and building resilience to climate change. So, for example, climate-friendly agricultural practices could be incentivized through the different parts of the CAP program, through agri-insurance, through agri-invest. There's lots of mechanisms in there already that could be used to incentivize the kind of practices that are going to reduce agriculture's impact on climate change and make our farms better able to withstand the effects of climate change. So all of that stuff is on the table, but I think there's also opportunities with Environment Canada, with the federal government commitment to plant 2 billion trees in Canada over the next 10 years. Agricultural land is a big chunk of the land mass of this country. And if we're going to plant 2 billion trees in the country, it would be great to get a bunch of those on farmland, because we know that windbreaks, shelter belts, wood lots, these are all things that can have big environmental benefits on farms and have big benefits for farmers in terms of their productivity and resilience. So we're looking at the whole gamut of policy options.
Katie, maybe I can get your perspective, and I'll just throw in a tidbit that despite the Trudeau government's commitment for a new climate plan, the mandate letter for Minister Bibeau did not mention climate change at all.
Yeah, so to build on that a little bit, one thing that we've noticed recently is that the federal government is, in combination with their provincial and territorial counterparts, undergoing a review of the business risk management programs for agriculture, and farm groups across the country have been in chorus, basically, to explain to the government that current disaster relief programs under agri-stability, for example, are simply not working, and especially in the face of the major weather disasters that farmers have been experiencing in the last couple of years. And so one thing we have pointed out at the National Farmers Union to the federal government as they're reconsidering this is that we really need to be at pains to understand that good climate planning and practices and policy for agriculture have an aim that we are going to undergo fewer disasters in agriculture going forward. If we can work towards a more stable climate situation, then farmers are not going to be needing to rely on as much disaster insurance as we are currently seeing in a system that is really just not set up to deal with the instability that we're facing right now, but that we can plan for future success and that are going to assist farmers in doing the right thing by our environment, and that are going to help farmers be more profitable, because we'd all rather be able to make money farming and be good stewards of our environment and good stewards of our land while we're farming, as opposed to facing weather disasters and having to rely on relief programs that currently aren't functional in the system that we're facing. So when we're asking the federal government to plan and to look at instituting programs under CAP that will be helping farmers to do the right thing, we're actually trying to make a business case to the government as well, that, you know, this is the smart financial thing to do. And we think that, you know, with a chorus of voices calling for that together, that we really hope that government will listen.
Well, that's great. I appreciate your perspective, and I think this has provided a lot of good substance for discussion and getting people thinking in more depth about what could be done at the federal level in particular. So thanks, Katie and Brent, for taking the time to do this on a Sunday or Saturday morning, rather, and time from your day. We'll look forward to future developments in this campaign and the growth of the coalition to broaden out to other groups as well. So we'll keep track of your campaign and maybe follow up with you in the future.
Yeah, if I could just say thank you very much for having us today, but also I would encourage your listeners to go to farmersforclimatesolutions.ca and check out the information we have and the videos that we've posted, and you know, click on the Take Action button, and you can take action on your farm, and you can share our information with farm groups that you might be part of, and we're happy to have lots more conversations.
I'm Paul Smith. I'm one of the hosts of Food Farm Talk here on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast. You've heard the show today about Farmers for Climate Solutions. You may have your own thoughts about it. Please leave those thoughts on our social media feeds. We won't be doing as many shows in the middle of the COVID-19 situation, but we will produce shows as we are able. So stay tuned for our next show, and thanks a lot for listening to today's show. Stay safe.